Okay, we're going to get started again. We're in the home stretch. It's almost the evening. Yay. So we get to this one last short presentation, and then we'll do something fun, something to look forward to. So this is going to be a very short presentation on credit cards. Okay. What we're finding is that credit cards are being used more frequently and for more reasons than they have in the past. While that is not necessarily a problem, we just wanted to revisit the need for controls. You know how I love internal controls over the use of your credit cards and why we think these controls are so important. Okay, I took this information on this slide directly from the auditor's manual. So the auditor's office, as the name implies, audits the claims of the county before those claims are paid. Every county has established procedures for processing those accounts payable. Me. Oh, there we go. Okay, got it. So every county has established procedures for your county for processing accounts payable or the claims from all your departments and offices. The county auditor does not have to have personal knowledge of every purchase or good that was purchased or every service provided. You just have to have insurance in place that those claims are legitimate claims of the county. So when the procedures are followed the way that you set them out, you are able to get that assurance. You're able to audit those claims and provide those to your governing board for approval and payment. Then you and the treasurer together, with the auditor initiating the claim, we've gone through that claims process as far as issuing the warrant and then getting the payment made. Okay, this is the system that's been used for years. It works. We know there are problems, and that's usually when the procedures aren't followed, but overall it does work. The statute does provide what is needed for claims approval, and that is found in Indiana Code 5-11-10-1.6C. And in that, it says you must have a fully itemized invoice or bill that shows what was purchased, how much, what price, what service was provided. Is there a contract that supports the service or something that shows you what the amount is that should be paid? The person, the county employee or the official who received the goods or the services has certified that those goods and services were received. So there, you don't have to have personal knowledge because they're certifying, yes, this good was received or these services were received. The invoice is attached to an AP voucher or the claim form. Has to be provided to the auditor. If it's sitting on their desk, it's not going to get paid. It's got to get into your office. Your office audits that claim for accuracy, sufficient fund balance and appropriation, the necessary signatures and supporting documents, and then certifies that it's true and correct, that you've gone through all those checks on it. Give it to the governing board. They approve it at a public meeting, and then the payment goes forward. I'd like to also point out there are procurement policies in the statute. So we all know for large contracts and projects, you have to go through bids and quotes depending on the size of it. And those contracts or bids are awarded to the lowest most responsive bidder. And what about the smaller purchases? So there are statutes on that. If your purchase is below $50,000, So you have a purchasing agent. They may make a purchase under a small purchase policy that your county has established. So you set procedures up for purchasing things under $50,000 to streamline that process. Okay. Most goods and services fall below that. These aren't big projects. You're buying a box of paper or, whatever you need to keep your office running. Okay. There is also a statute that when you're purchasing services, the governing body can adopt any appropriate procedures for the procurement of those services. Set out the policies that are necessary for that, and then you need to follow those policies. So for most of you, your county has established or approved vendors that you purchase from. Your departments, at the very least, have a supplies budget to limit the amount on supplies. You might, hopefully, have more detailed procedures up to including purchase orders as a mechanism to establish controls over the purchase of your supplies and services. If a department spends too much of their supply budget, then they would have to come before the council and ask for additional appropriation, which may or may not be approved. The department should be, we've talked about this before, tracking their budgets and their claims to ensure that their spending is within the budget. It's not a perfect world, and I realize that you're sometimes faced with claims that you do not have sufficient appropriation or even worse, sufficient fund balance for. And we've discussed this, how, ways to work around that, to find another fund, to get additional appropriations for those to get paid. And if someone does not follow the procedures established, then you're kind of relying on your council and your commissioners maybe to further restrict their purchasing if they're not following the rules. Can't let this go by without addressing internal controls at some point. One part of internal controls is risk assessment. Risk assessment is when you're looking at your procedures and you're kind of brainstorming what could go wrong. Not necessarily what has or what will, but what could go wrong. Where is the risk that we're going to overspend, that we're not going to have sufficient appropriation or sufficient fund balance, that we're not going to be able to process our accounts payable? And I want to go through a few scenarios just to get you thinking about the difference between your standard accounts payable that we talked about. Like I said, it works, and other ways to make purchases. So I'm going to talk about 3 different scenarios. The first one we pretty much discussed, and that's your standard purchase order or standard purchasing, where you what you follow in making the purchase, attaching the invoice, sending the claim in, getting it approved. But we're also going to talk about what happens when you're using a purchase like with petty cash or with a credit card, and just think about the differences that does to your system. Okay. So with your standard, this is kind of a cycle that you go through. You place an order with your vendor. The department gets the goods, hopefully, and the invoice for that. They're going to fill out the claim form. They're going to attach that invoice to it. They're going to certify the goods they received. Hopefully they've done an inventory and checked off what was received and what wasn't, so they're not paying on that invoice if goods were not received on what they ordered. They're going to send that claim to the auditor's office. You're someone in your office, your claims person, is going to look through that and make sure it's accurate, mathematically correct. If you ordered 6 boxes at a certain cost, is that what you were charged, the correct cost? You're going to look at what appropriation line they're charging it to. Do they have sufficient appropriation? Look at the fund, usually general fund for most budgets. Is there sufficient money to pay for that? If it's another fund, is there enough money in the fund, a grant fund, for example, or a special revenue fund? Is there sufficient fund to pay in that? Because we never want to spend our funds below 0 unless it's a reimbursable grant fund. Then you turn that over to your board for approval, and you're going to issue the warrant, start that through the payment process. So we just talked about that. So let's just look at petty cash. Excuse me. So Indiana Code 36-1-H-3 provides for petty cash funds for political subdivisions. And the statute language is right on here. You're already familiar with. You probably have petty cash funds for some of your departments. They are usually established to make small emergency purchases that really can't wait for the claims process. Evenings or weekends when something's broken down at the highway, they need to get something fixed, things like that. If we look back at that cycle we were just looking at the time they're placing the order, they're also paying for the good. So if there's some part they need and they go to Napa and buy the part, they're paying for it out of that petty cash fund. So as far as the vendor's concerned, they got their payment. So instead of an invoice to attach to the claim to pay the vendor, you've got a receipt. So the receipt should be turned back into the custodian of the petty cash fund. And at all times, that custodian should be able to reconcile the amount they have still in the cash in the fund, the total receipts they have, and that should total back to the amount of fund that was advanced to the petty cash. They should always be able to do that at all times. So if there is a $100 petty cash fund and there's $37 in cash in the box, then they should have $63 in voucher receipts to go with that. So it totals $100. Okay. At some point, they're going to decide they need to replenish that. So they're going to fill out the claim at that point. They're going to fill out that AP voucher. They're going to ask for an additional, in our example, additional $63. And they're going to attach receipts where all that $63 was spent, those original receipts that were brought back to them. It's going to be completed. They're going to sign off, certify they received the goods, send that to the auditor. Then it's going to go through the same claims process. They're going to audit it for accuracy, send it to the board for approval. And when it's approved and the warrant is issued, it's actually going to have a check that's issued back to the custodian to cash and put the $63 back in the petty cash fund. So for risk assessment, what are the risks? The department still needs to ensure there's sufficient cash balance and sufficient appropriation. You still have a risk of overspending, but that's usually addressed by limiting the amount of the petty cash fund. They only have $100. So that's the most they can spend. Okay. So you have controls that you establish over the petty cash fund, and we do have uniform accounting procedures for those in the county bulletins on petty cash funds, on how that's supposed to be done, which I kind of just discussed. On what type of purchases are allowed to be purchased. What can you purchase with this? And again, it's usually small emergency purchases, parts for repairs, postage due on something. Just small things that need to be done right away. And there should be policies that include procedures for situations when petty cash is misused, when it's used when it's not supposed to. So an example might be, I'm going to kind of change something that I saw once. So if you have a petty cash fund and you've asked for something and it's been turned down, you cannot, by council or commissioners, you cannot turn around and use your petty cash fund to buy that. Okay. It's happened. Believe me, they just upped their petty cash and then they just bought it anyway. So that's a misuse of it. So chronic misuse of it might resolve in taking the petty cash fund away. If you have someone, at the other end, if they're constantly using it, but they're never bringing the receipts back, so you have nothing to attach to the claim, don't replenish it. At that point, you really can't document, $63 worth of expenses, but you're not going to give them any more money to keep doing that. Because you have policies in place on what is allowed to be spent from that. And without those receipts, you're not going to get any more money for that petty cash fund. And it's limited by the amount of that. And that's why one of the procedures with petty cash is to make sure that that fund is not any larger than it needs to be to accomplish its purchase. Okay, credit cards. Just like with petty cash, when you purchase with a credit card, as far as the vendor is concerned, payment is made when you give them that card. Okay? They've been paid. You now have an obligation to the financial institution that gave you, advanced you that credit. But for the vendor, they're paid. So in this case, again, you're not going to have an invoice. You're going to have a receipt for what was actually purchased. Hopefully they kept the original receipt for what they purchased with the credit card. You will receive an invoice and a credit card bill from your financial institution for all of the charges against that account number for any charges made during that billing period. Hopefully the department will complete your claim voucher, attach all of those original receipts, and support the charges on that credit card bill. They will give you the appropriate fund and appropriate appropriation, what line item you're using, what fund it's coming out of, as well as certifying the charges received. And that AP voucher, that claim, is again going to be submitted to the auditor for processing. Depending on the number of cards that are associated with that credit card bill or the number of individuals with access to that card or their number, there can be multiple charges on that credit card statement or multiple claims that provide the supporting documentation. Credit cards are neither good nor bad. They're just a financial tool that provide a convenient payment method when used responsibly. But they can be used to bypass your accounts payable. And depending on the credit limit, they can cause potentially more risk than those petty cash purchases, because most credit card limits aren't $100. And as I said, we're seeing more and more that credit cards are being used. For a long time, we just saw them for travel. You just use them when you needed to go travel. And then suddenly IT started using them for their online purchases. And now you're seeing them used a lot more for paying. Sometimes I believe schools are using them almost exclusively to pay their claims. We do not take exception to the use of credit cards. You can use credit cards for your payments. But we do require you to have controls over the use of those credit cards. In Chapter 1 of the Accounting and Uniform Compliance Guideline Manuals is our audit position on the use of credit cards. And we're going to go over that to try to explain the different lines in that and what they mean. Again, just keep in mind what we're trying to say with this and make sure you're including this when you're addressing your credit card policies. Again, keep in mind that when you give an official or an employee, the county gives an official or employee access to a credit card, you have been given permission to spend. You theoretically can spend up to the credit limit on that card. As far as the credit card, the financial institution is concerned, you could take that card out the next day, and if it had a $5,000 limit on it, you could spend $5,000. Nothing is going to stop you from doing that. What we have seen is most people do not abuse the credit card. There are instances where people have, officials have. We've had charge cases and fraudulent cases, obviously, where people have misused the credit card. And those need to be addressed. I mean, that's the reason, that's one of the risks. Someone could misuse this card. Okay. It also seems to be a quirk of human nature that they know what they wanted, they've got. They got the card, they got the good. I don't really care whether you ever get what you need to pay that bill, honestly. So if the receipt, it goes through the wash, left in the back of their vehicle, they dropped it in the trash. Sorry, my bad. You're the one that's got to put that credit card claim together. So we're hoping that if you have strong controls and you have policies in place, just like with the petty cash, just like the other claims, that address allowable uses of the card and what will happen when you do not properly follow those procedures, they will start to care whether or not you have the information you need to pay those credit card claims. The first thing you need is authorization from your governing board through an ordinance to even have credit cards. It is not something a department can just decide on their own. I'm gonna get me a credit card. You have to have a policy for the county on whether or not you're even going to allow the use of credit cards. So that's the first, number one in there. Secondly, an official or employee must be designated by the governing body to handle the issuance of the card. That probably falls on the auditor most of the time. The considerations you're making are who gets to use the card, who has access, how is that determined, when is that determined? You should know how many cards are out there, how many accounts are out there, who's using them. That should all be under your control. It shouldn't be a surprise to you to get a credit card bill and not know that there's a credit card out there. And it may not be the auditor, it may be somebody else, but a lot of times it just falls on you guys. Third, the ordinance should be specific in stating when the card may be used. Is it restricted to travel only? Can it be used for online purchases? If the purpose is not specifically stated in the ordinance, the credit card should not be used. It should only be used for the amount, what is specifically stated in your ordinance. So you've looked as a county and you've made the decision what is allowable for the use of that credit card. And you've let everyone else know through the policy what they're allowed to do with that credit card. When the purpose has been accomplished, travel has been completed, the online purchase has been made, whatever is going on, the credit card should be returned to the custody of the responsible person. Number two, the designated person. We would recommend, and what we would like to see for the most part, is that the auditor's office has control of those cards, logs them out. We're going to talk about that, logs them back in. In reality, that probably is not happening. You probably have officials that are carrying those cards on their person 24/7. If you issue your officials or your departments their own cards that they get to carry around, you need to have procedures in place to make the purchases on those cards tracked. Someone has to be tracking that. Probably, the department head should be doing it if they're the one that's responsible for that card. Can't be you if you don't have control of the card. So someone else, you're going to have to work that into your policy. Someone else has to be doing that. Now we're going into the accounting system. There needs to be an accounting system for the use of the cards. When that credit card bill comes in, you should already know. You should have the receipts, have all the supporting documents for all of the charges on that bill. You should be able to sit down and just tick and tie that off, be ready to pay that claim. How many times does that actually happen? Probably not very often unless you have really good controls. If you're logging the cards out, you have a little more control over that. And that's a situation where you log it out to a person, say someone's going to travel. So you give it to department head, they're traveling somewhere, they take the card, they bring the card back to you when they come back from their trip, they return the card and all of their receipts with that card, you log the card back in, you've got the receipts. You've got a file with all the receipts, you're ready for the bill when it comes in. If the department has their own card, then they need to be doing that. They need to be logging when they used it. They need to be tracking that. And I know most of them aren't, but they should be tracking when they're using it, how much they used it for. They need to be comparing that to their appropriation, make sure they're not overspending, just like they do with any of their other claims. Having audited credit card claims at various units, not just counties, but cities and towns and other places, I have found that this system was rarely used. Most offices were scrambling to get the supporting documents after the credit card statement had been received, and you don't have a lot of turnaround on those credit card statements. And this resulted in charges being paid based on the credit card statement alone because you didn't have anything else. Credit cards should not be used to bypass the accounting system, just as we talked in with petty cash. If it is not an allowable use of the credit card, it should not be used on the credit card. If you've asked for a piece of equipment and the commissioner said, no, you don't get to use your credit card, go out and buy that equipment anyway. It should not be used to bypass the accounts payable system. And again, you should not have the mindset, I'll just get whatever I need. We'll just let the auditor worry about paying the credit card bill when it comes in. If the county is lax with their credit card policy, and there's no discipline or there's no follow-up on the policy is not followed, it becomes exponentially more difficult to process those credit cards. What can you do? I mean, you really have any backbone or any teeth to it if the policy is not enforced. So make sure the policy should clearly specify what the card may be used for, that policy ordinance should be followed. What happens if you don't? Maybe you lose the use of that credit card. Maybe you have to repay if you've misused it. There should be procedures in place. I realize that accounts payable for government takes time. You know that. It's not like you can just write a check today because something's due. Credit cards are easy. You pay it, it's done. But it, again, should not be used to bypass that accounts payable system. So make sure you keep your controls in place when you're using those credit cards to make payments. Credit card bill alone is not sufficient documentation to pay the credit card charges. If you read the credit card bill, you can tell a lot of times you can't even tell what was purchased on the statement. Okay? It's not a sufficiently itemized claim. You need those original receipts to show you that. So they should be turning those in. Again, if they're logging them out, logging them back in, you've got that. If they're not doing it at a central location, they need at least to be doing that at a departmental level. Somebody at the department should be tracking those and keeping all those receipts together for those claims. As we discussed earlier, to your vendor, they've been paid. The agreement with your financial institute for the credit card is what you're paying on that credit card bill. You're paying your financial institution, you're not paying the vendor at this point. If your card has been used by an authorized user, the county owes the amount charged. Doesn't matter if it violates the credit card policy. They were authorized to use it. County owes that money. You trusted them to use it. It's like giving it to your kid. You trusted them to use it correctly. They didn't. You still owe that money. You can't not pay it. It's the county's obligation. They have a line of credit that has to be paid. If it's used by an unauthorized user, someone gets access, hacks the number, finds the number, yeah, you can dispute that and you shouldn't pay those. You dispute that directly with a credit card. We did not authorize the use of this card or the number for this purchase and get that taken off. But even if they used it for a personal expense by mistake, you still have to pay it, then have them repay the county. You understand the difference between that? Because we've had some issues where, not just with counties, but with cities and towns where they think, oh, well, that's not allowable use, we just won't pay it. You got to pay it because you agreed in your agreement, your credit agreement with the credit card company that you would pay it. So your policy should say if there are unallowable charges, how those charges are going to be repaid. And if there is an annual fee, that can be paid. We don't take exception to that, paying a fee for the use of the credit card. That is the basis of what the minimum we want to see in a credit card policy. Yours, of course, can be more detailed than that, but that's the minimum of what we want to see. Some other things we'd like you to consider when you're establishing or reviewing your credit card policy is just thinking about, again, risk assessment. Who has access to use the cards or the credit card numbers? Should all of them have that kind of access? They all need to have that. Again, is anyone tracking those purchases? Is anyone checking that there is, before they make the purchase, that there's sufficient appropriation and fund balance for that claim to be paid later on? What's the limit on your credit card? What's the amount of risk you're willing to do? Like I said, most credit cards aren't going to be $100. You should decide what's the limit, what's the amount you're willing to go with that credit card. If it should get lost or stolen, if someone should misuse it, how much are you willing to pay? That's an individual decision, but you should assess that as a county. It shouldn't be any higher than what you need to accomplish your purpose for those cards. Does the credit card have a cash advance function? If it does, should that be turned off? Again, that's a county decision. But look at it. If interest is charged from day one of a cash advance, you can't pay interest, or it can be charged against you. And why are they advancing cash anyway? Is there ever a need for them to get cash out of that credit card? So it's certainly something to consider. Shouldn't that function be turned off? Who's going to handle the tracking? Do you want to do it centrally? Do you want to have it done at the departments? Again, just make a decision. It's a countywide policy. And finally, credit cards should be in the EIN and name of the county. Do not have an official or an employee use their EIN for this their social security number to get this credit card. Needs to be in the name of the county. Your policy should also address, think about this, how will late charges be addressed? How do you determine who's responsible for the late charges? It's not always your office that's responsible. So how is that responsibility diffused? How do you determine where that breakdown came? What if insufficient documentation is provided? How are you going to address that? If they don't have the original receipt, what do you do? There are times in this electronic age where you can get copies of that original receipt. The date and the time that you made the purchase, you can go back and get it. It's a lot of work, but if they lost the original and they have to go back and get it, maybe they'll remember next time to hold on to it. If they try and they can't, what's going to be your substitute? Because if State Board of Accounts pulls a claim and it's all paid on basis of the credit card statement, it's potentially a finding. You need those receipts, but you're between a rock and a hard place. You got to pay the claim. Okay, so you want some procedures in place to protect you on that. Okay, what's your process if personal charges are made to the county credit card? How are those going to be repaid? Why, how are you going to address, why did that happen? How do we prevent that from happening in the future? What if the card is lost or stolen? What are the procedures for the responsible person to let you know that that card was lost or stolen so you can cancel that card before it is used by someone that is not authorized to use it? When an employee leaves employment who had access to the card or to the numbers, are the provisions needed at that point? Do you need to cancel that account that they had access to or change it out? So to sum it up, points to remember: when at the time the credit card is used, the payment is made to the vendor. So that part of the accounts payable has already been done, and it short circuits a little bit. So there should be strong internal controls over the use of the credit card. The credit card statement needs to be reviewed when it comes in. Any charges not made by an authorized user should be disputed. So someone needs to be reviewing and make, just like you would on your own personal credit card. Were all of these charges valid county charges? And if not, you need to be calling the credit card company and disputing those charges. Any charges that were made by an authorized user that are in violation of the policy, there's going to have to be handled within the county based on your county policy. You're still going to have to pay the charges, but you're going to have to work within the county to get the repayment or get that rectified. Any questions on that? Yes.
Trying. She agreed to pay his mileage. So I requested documentation to pay that claim. She has nothing. It's a verbal agreement. I said, send me something in writing, your writing, saying, this is what the agreement was, this is when it took place, you know, and the information I needed. And at first she wouldn't do it. And she finally did send me something. Would that be acceptable to pay his mileage claim?
This is not a credit card question, right?
No, not at all.
I'm trying to figure out how the credit card works in there. Yeah, you have to determine whether you have sufficient supporting documentation. If there was an agreement, you can get it in writing.
Yeah, it's in her writing, our county official. She just basically sent me an email saying, this is what we agreed to. This is when it happened.
That person provided a service to the county.
Yes.
And the payment for that service was to pay the mileage.
Right.
Yes, if you've got that in writing, that should be sufficient.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yes.
Is it supposed to be the gold standard that you are supposed to specify, you know, and that if it's not in there, they can't spend?
Best interest to say that what the credit card is to be used for, because you don't want to begin bypassing the accounts payable. So you don't want them, you know, if a department has a budget and they're supposed to be following approved claims procedures, you don't want them just using the credit card for everything.
Mm-hmm.
You see what I'm saying? So
does it not, frankly, though, vary according?
Sorry. Let them use it for everything.
That doesn't give you the flexibility to let it vary according to department head and how much you trust the department head as a designated holder of the card, right? That methodology.
It's a county decision. If that's what you've decided to do, there could be issues with that. That's risky, a lot of risks.
Now, why didn't you put your hand up when I was over there? Thank you. So we have a credit card policy with our company, with our county, and several departments have them. But recently, we had a situation where a judge had charged food at a restaurant and exceeded the amount allowable for gratuity. And we asked them to receipt the extra money into the treasurer's office. And they basically said that they didn't have to follow county handbook. They don't have their own. And so I see it as both a violation of the credit card policy and also the county policy. So how do I handle that?
It's a court. You do what you can. I mean, as far as the audit, we will ask them if they have a court policy. If they have not adopted a written court policy they should have provided you, so you would know whether they had or not. We would default to the county policy, and the comment would be against the court.
They're also paying for this with a grant fund, and I have documentation from the grant group that says that the courts are to follow the county policy and it supersedes the grant policy. And I still have resistance. So do I just let it go based on my documentation?
I would document everything. I would certainly include it in my report to the grantor agency that they did not follow that. They may not keep that grant. And again, any comment is going to be against the court because they did not follow county policy and they did not have their own policy that they were going to do.
Personally, I wish we didn't have credit cards.
Yeah, they are. They are. Again, I think we show this every time you have questions or you're not sure, you want to brainstorm on something, you can always call Ricky and I. Again, this is the county policy. The audit position we have is what's in the chapter. That's the minimum that we expect to see. And what we audit against for the bare minimum. But if you want, again, it can certainly be more evolved than that, or more involved than that. So again, if you have questions about it or issues, be sure and give us a call. We'll be glad to talk it over with you.